A young flight attendant stopped at row 2. An elderly black woman sat there, her cream-colored blazer and pearls catching the light. "Ma'am," she said, "you're in the wrong seat. Move to economy." Passengers paused, heads turned. The woman lifted her gaze, steady, patient. She pulled out her boarding pass and held it up. "First class, seat 2A, printed in black and white." The flight attendant barely glanced. "There's been a mistake. You're not supposed to be here." The murmurs began. Someone leaned forward. From the back, a young woman gasped, "Wait, do you know who she is?" The flight attendant squared her shoulders. "Ma'am, I won't ask again. Move, or I'll escalate this." Phones came out. Cameras started rolling. The elderly woman didn't move an inch. She had spent a lifetime fighting battles like this, and she wasn't about to stand up now. Evelyn Carter stepped onto the plane with the quiet grace of a woman who had spent a lifetime standing her ground. At 76, she had seen the world change, and yet some things never did. She adjusted the strap of her elegant cream-colored purse and made her way down the aisle, her steps slow but steady. She barely glanced at the other passengers in first class, most of them already settled in, sipping their complimentary drinks or scrolling through their phones. Evelyn wasn't new to this world. She had worked too hard, fought too many battles, to feel out of place. Seat 2A, right where she belonged. Lowering herself carefully into the plush leather chair, she exhaled. The exhaustion of her long trip weighed on her bones, but she didn't show it. Years in the courtroom had taught her how to maintain an unshakable presence. A flight attendant, young, sharp-eyed, moving with a certain unearned confidence, approached from the aisle. "Ma'am," she said, her voice clipped, "I'm sorry, but you'll need to move to economy. This seat isn't for you." Evelyn didn't look up immediately. Instead, she adjusted her blazer, making sure the delicate pearl brooch pinned to her lapel was secure. Then, with deliberate patience, she lifted her gaze. "Excuse me?" Her voice was calm, but firm. Miss Reynolds, her name tag gleaming under the cabin lights, tightened her stance, squaring her shoulders. "There must have been a mistake. This is a first-class cabin. You're not supposed to be here." Evelyn blinked, processing the words carefully. Without a word, she reached into her bag, pulled out her boarding pass, and extended it toward the attendant. "Seat 2A, she said. "First class." Miss Reynolds barely glanced at it. "There's been a mix-up," she insisted. "I'll have to ask you to move." A small ripple of silence passed through the cabin. Passengers, some already watching, began lowering their devices, tilting their heads slightly, sensing something wasn't right. Evelyn still hadn't raised her voice. She didn't need to. "Miss," she said, her tone measured, "you might want to check your list." Miss Reynolds crossed her arms. "That won't be necessary. I know where passengers are supposed to sit." A businessman 2 rows behind nudged his wife. "You seeing this?" he muttered. His wife frowned, shifting in her seat. "That woman's not causing any trouble. Why is she pressing this so hard?" Another voice chimed in from across the aisle, low, confused. "Why isn't she looking at the ticket?" Evelyn sat still, watching, waiting. She had spent decades navigating these moments where people refused to see what was right in front of them. The murmurs grew, whispers turning into exchanged glances. A young woman in her 20s, sitting near the window, furrowed her brows. She squinted at Evelyn, studying her face as if trying to place it. Then her eyes widened. "Oh my God," she breathed. She grabbed her phone, fingers moving quickly. She typed Evelyn Carter into her search bar. Her heart skipped as the results loaded. The photos, the headlines, the court cases, the marches. Her jaw tensed. Does this flight attendant even know who she's talking to? She turned to the passenger beside her. "You're not going to believe this," she whispered, tilting her screen toward them. More heads turned. More people began watching. But Miss Reynolds remained oblivious. She exhaled sharply, her patience wearing thin. "I need you to move," she said. "Now." Evelyn Carter simply stared at her. She wasn't going anywhere. The tension in first class had shifted. The quiet hum of conversation had dimmed to a murmur. Passengers now half distracted from their in-flight magazines and half focused on the confrontation unfolding just a few feet away. Miss Reynolds stood her ground, her posture stiff, her arms now folded across her chest. She should have stopped. She should have checked. But she was too deep in now. "Ma'am, I need you to move," she repeated, a forced patience lacing her voice. Evelyn Carter held her gaze, still calm, still unwavering. "Young lady," Evelyn said, her voice smooth as polished stone, "I've already shown you my ticket." She lifted the boarding pass once again, holding it delicately between two fingers, as if giving Miss Reynolds one final chance to see what was right in front of her. Miss Reynolds barely looked at it. Instead, she let out a short, clipped breath. "You need to understand," she said, lowering her voice slightly. "This is first class." A man 2 rows back shook his head slowly, watching. "Unbelievable," he muttered under his breath. His wife nudged him. "Don't get involved," she whispered. But it was too late. People were already paying attention. Near the front of the cabin, a well-dressed businessman adjusted his tie, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. He had flown hundreds of flights. He knew how things worked. This wasn't standard procedure. He glanced over at the passenger next to him. Did she even check the list? The woman beside him frowned. "She doesn't need to. The ticket's right there." The businessman sighed, rubbing his temple. The flight attendant was making a mistake. A big one. Across the aisle, a younger couple exchanged looks. "This doesn't feel right," the man murmured, shifting uncomfortably. His girlfriend, a woman in her 20s with dark curls pulled into a bun, squinted at Evelyn. Something about the elderly woman seemed familiar. "Wait," she whispered. She grabbed her phone and quickly typed a name into the search bar. Evelyn Carter. The results loaded instantly. She blinked, stared. Her stomach dropped. "Oh my God," she whispered. She nudged the woman next to her. "Look at this." More passengers leaned in, peeking at her screen. There it was, photo after photo. Headlines, news articles. Evelyn Carter, civil rights attorney. Evelyn Carter, one of the first black women to argue before the Supreme Court. Evelyn Carter, Lifetime Achievement Award recipient. The younger woman's breath hitched. "Does she even know who she's talking to?" she muttered under her breath. 3 rows back, another woman, older, maybe in her 50s, finally placed the face. She sat up straighter, her eyes wide. "Wait," she said, a little too loudly. Her husband looked at her, confused. "That's Evelyn Carter," she whispered. "You know, the one who fought that discrimination case in—" She stopped herself, lowering her voice. "Oh, this is bad." Miss Reynolds, still standing firm, didn't notice the way the whispers were spreading. Didn't notice the side eyes and the subtle shake of heads. Didn't notice that someone, 3 rows back, had just hit record on their phone. She was too focused on the one woman who wasn't backing down. Evelyn exhaled slowly, then adjusted her blazer. She wasn't moving, and she wasn't explaining herself either. She had spent a lifetime earning her place, and she wasn't about to prove it to a flight attendant who refused to see it. The tension in the first-class cabin had become a living thing. It hung in the air, thick and unspoken, stretching across the space like a taut wire ready to snap. Miss Reynolds crossed her arms tighter, her jaw tightening along with them. She had expected this woman to move. Expected a little resistance, maybe. But not this. Not the growing murmurs. Not the way the air itself seemed to push back against her. Her patience wore thin. "Ma'am," she said, louder now, firmer. "I've asked you nicely. I don't want to cause a scene. But you're being—" She hesitated, searching for the right words. Then she found them. "You're being disruptive." The shift was immediate. A sharp intake of breath rippled through the rows. It wasn't confusion anymore. It was outrage. Someone muttered a quiet, stunned, "Oh no." And then, from the middle of the cabin, a voice cut through the silence like a blade. "No, she's not," a young black woman said, her tone sharp, unwavering. "You are." Eyes turned toward her. She was in her late 20s, with dark, coiled curls pulled into a high bun, and a look on her face that burned with disbelief. She stared directly at Miss Reynolds, unblinking, challenging her in a way the flight attendant wasn't prepared for. "You're the one making a scene," she added, leaning forward slightly in her seat. The cabin held its breath. A few rows back, the businessman from earlier glanced around, reading the room. Passengers weren't just watching anymore. They were reacting. Some were whispering, some were shaking their heads. And him? He had seen enough. He reached into his suit pocket, pulled out his phone, and tapped the record button. The screen glowed as he held it steady, making sure to capture everything. The camera lens focused on Miss Reynolds, who had suddenly lost the confidence she once carried. She was faltering now. She could feel it. She started, but the words stumbled. She looked around as if searching for support. But the other flight attendants weren't near. The passengers? They weren't on her side. And Evelyn Carter? She still hadn't moved. Still hadn't raised her voice. Still sat there with that same quiet steel in her eyes. Miss Reynolds swallowed hard. "I have the right," she insisted, her voice wavering now, to escalate this. The businessman's phone zoomed in slightly. Did she just say escalate? A man across the aisle whispered. His wife let out a slow exhale. She has no idea what she's doing. Miss Reynolds reached for her earpiece. She had decided. She was calling it in. And just like that, she sealed her fate. Passengers shifted uncomfortably. Disbelief thick in the air. Seriously? Someone muttered. More phones came out. More screens glowed. The young woman who had spoken up earlier shook her head slowly. You're about to regret this, she murmured, her voice just low enough to be caught by the camera's mic. Because this moment? This wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. This question mark was about to become a viral disaster. The sharp click of polished heels echoed through the aisle as the flight supervisor appeared at the front of the cabin. She moved quickly, her navy uniform crisp, her posture stiff with authority and urgency. Passengers shifted in their seats, murmuring as she approached. The tension had thickened to something suffocating, pressing against the walls of first class like a storm cloud ready to burst. Miss Reynolds stepped back slightly, her arms still folded, but her eyes flickered with something. Uncertainty, maybe even regret. The supervisor exhaled, her expression unreadable, and turned to Evelyn Carter. Ma'am, she said, her voice softer, more professional. May I see your ticket? Evelyn didn't hesitate. With the same calm she had carried since the beginning, she handed over her boarding pass. The supervisor took it, her eyes scanning the text carefully. First class. Seat 2A, printed in bold, undeniable ink. She double-checked her tablet, looked at Evelyn, then at Miss Reynolds. Finally, she spoke. She's in the right seat. The moment stretched. Passengers leaned in slightly, absorbing the confirmation like a jolt to the system. The businessman filming didn't lower his phone. Neither did anyone else. Somewhere, a woman let out a low, whispered, "Wow." And then Miss Reynolds did the one thing she shouldn't have done. She didn't step back, didn't apologize, didn't even acknowledge the mistake. Instead, she doubled down. "She's making me uncomfortable," she said. Gasps. The words landed like a slap across the cabin. Evelyn Carter didn't flinch. But the passengers? They reacted instantly. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the rows. A woman in a business suit near the window shook her head, eyes narrowing in disgust. A middle-aged black man 3 rows back let out a hollow, knowing chuckle. "There it is," he muttered. Miss Reynolds felt the shift, felt the weight of every single pair of eyes now on her. She tried to stand taller, but her hands were clenched into fists at her sides. A man near the front turned to his wife, exhaling sharply. Did she really just say that? His wife's jaw was tight, unreadable. She did. And then, a voice, clear, loud, and unshaken. "Are you serious?" The young black woman from earlier had risen slightly in her seat, her eyes locked on Miss Reynolds. "You're the one making her uncomfortable," she said, her voice ringing through the space like a bell. The murmurs turned into loud objections. "She literally has her ticket. Why are you still pushing this? This is ridiculous." More phones lifted. More screens glowed. The businessman recording turned his camera slightly, catching everything. He smirked slightly, murmuring under his breath, "This is already on Twitter." A passenger 2 rows down had her screen open. The video was already being shared. Miss Reynolds noticed the phones, noticed the faces, the judgment. Her chest rose and fell quickly now. The flight supervisor's voice was sharp this time. "Miss Reynolds," she said, "we need to talk. Now." Miss Reynolds froze. The passengers weren't just watching anymore. They were witnessing. And within minutes, so would the rest of the world. The hum of the plane's engines was no longer the loudest sound in first class. It was the murmurs, the shaking heads, the whispered exclamations of disbelief, and the soft but unmistakable ding of notifications. Phones were out everywhere now. Passengers weren't just watching anymore. They were recording, sharing, spreading. And the internet? It was moving faster than the plane itself. 2 rows behind Evelyn, a young woman in a denim jacket and gold hoop earrings had been typing furiously on her phone. Her thumbs moved fast, the words flowing with the urgency of a wildfire. She hit send. She really tried to kick Evelyn Carter out of first class. She fought for our rights, and she can't even sit down. Her heart pounded as she watched the numbers climb. Retweets, 1,200, then 5,000, then 15,000. In under 3 minutes. She turned to the woman next to her, showing the screen. "This is blowing up," she whispered. The other woman glanced at the phone, eyes widening. "Oh my God," she murmured. Across the aisle, The businessman, still recording, let out a low whistle. She's about to find out what viral means, he muttered. The flight attendant was still standing, still frozen, but something had shifted. Her confidence, the rigid authority she had carried just moments ago, was crumbling. She had felt it in the last few seconds. The way the passengers no longer just whispered, but openly challenged her. The way her name was being spoken now, like a warning. She could feel it, the weight of a million unseen eyes, and she knew, even before she turned her head, that people were filming. Then came the sound that sent a chill down her spine. A soft tap on the intercom. The captain's voice, low and even, but unmistakably firm. "Flight supervisor, please report to the cockpit." The flight supervisor's eyes flicked toward the ceiling, where the call light blinked. Miss Reynolds inhaled sharply. Passengers watched as the supervisor gave her one last unreadable look before stepping away. The moment stretched, like the space between a lightning strike and the thunder that followed. Miss Reynolds didn't move, couldn't move. The businessman's phone zoomed in. On the ground, Twitter was already on fire. News accounts had picked up the story. Headlines were breaking in real time. Breaking: flight attendant. Attempts to remove civil rights attorney Evelyn Carter from first class. A new tweet surfaced, this one from a well-known journalist. "Do you understand the irony of trying to force Evelyn Carter out of a seat she paid for? This woman changed laws. You think she can't handle a flight attendant?" The replies poured in. "This is the worst PR disaster I've ever seen. How do you ruin your entire career in 30 minutes or less? Miss Reynolds just gave us a tutorial. Oh, she's done. Done." The flight was still miles from landing. But on the ground, her fate was already sealed. The hush that settled over first class was thick and heavy, as if the entire cabin was waiting for something inevitable to happen. The tension had shifted. It was no longer a confrontation. It was a reckoning. The flight supervisor returned, her face unreadable, her eyes flicking toward Evelyn first. Then, with a slow, deliberate breath, she turned to Miss Reynolds. "Step aside," she said, voice calm but firm. Miss Reynolds didn't move, didn't speak, but the subtle clench of her jaw, the way her hands trembled just slightly at her sides, those were the first signs. She knew. This was over. The flight supervisor turned to Evelyn, her posture straight, but her voice lower now, apologetic. "Miss Carter," she said carefully, "I sincerely apologize for the misunderstanding. You are, of course, welcome to remain in your seat." A ripple of disbelief passed through the passengers. That was it. No formal announcement? No holding Miss Reynolds accountable? A businessman in the aisle seat scoffed. "A little late for that, don't you think?" His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. The young black woman who had spoken up earlier let out a sharp, humorless laugh. "Wow," she muttered, shaking her head. "She's just supposed to sit here like nothing happened?" The supervisor stiffened, choosing to ignore the growing frustration around her. Evelyn, still poised, still unshaken, gave a slow nod. Then, she adjusted her blazer. "Thank you," she said, her voice smooth as silk. But there was something in her tone, something razor-sharp beneath the politeness, something that said, "I was never waiting for your permission." The flight supervisor turned back to Miss Reynolds. "Let's step into the galley," she said. It wasn't a request. Miss Reynolds hesitated. Passengers watched as the color drained from her face, as the weight of what had happened fully settled onto her shoulders. She glanced at Evelyn for half a second, and that was when she saw it, the cold, hard reality in her eyes. This wasn't just about one mistake. It was about what happened when you refused to listen, when you refused to see. Phones were still out, still recording. Every move was being documented. Miss Reynolds inhaled sharply, straightened her uniform, and finally took a stiff step back. The walk toward the galley felt longer than it should have, longer than the aisle itself, and the moment she disappeared, the entire cabin exhaled. Down on the ground, the story had already taken flight. A clip of the incident had been retweeted over 60,000 times. Breaking: flight attendant escorted away after attempting to remove civil rights icon Evelyn Carter from first class. A celebrity activist had weighed in. The fact that Evelyn Carter still has to fight for a seat she paid for tells you everything you need to know. The responses were relentless. Her career is over. This is about to be an airline PR nightmare. Does Miss Reynolds even know who she just messed with? By the time the wheels touched the runway, the world already knew. The seatbelt sign chimed, signaling arrival. But no one in first class moved. Not to grab their bags, not to rush the aisle. They were all watching the front of the plane, waiting for her. Miss Reynolds. She stood near the galley, her posture rigid, her face blank, as if holding herself together with sheer willpower. But the weight of what had happened, of what was still happening online, was crushing her. Then, without fanfare, without a final word, two uniformed airline officials stepped on board. They didn't look at the passengers. They didn't need to. They were only here for one reason. "Miss Reynolds," one of them said, voice even. "Come with us." She swallowed. Hard. Then stiffly, she obeyed. As she walked down the aisle, every pair of eyes followed her. Phones were still recording. She didn't look at them, didn't glance at Evelyn Carter. But the moment she stepped off the plane, it was official. She was out, and the world was already writing the ending for her. 15 minutes after landing, as passengers shuffled into the terminal, a notification lit up screens everywhere. Airline statement. "We sincerely apologize to Ms. Carter for the misunderstanding aboard Flight 227. The crew member involved has been removed from duty pending review. Our airline is committed to fairness, professionalism, and respect for all passengers." The response? Brutal. "Nice try. You're only sorry because we caught you." A misunderstanding? She tried to remove a civil rights icon from first class. "This statement is weaker than airplane coffee." The tweet ratioed instantly. Retweets, 85,000. Comments, unforgiving. The airline's stock price dipped within the hour. And Miss Reynolds? Her name was trending. For all the wrong reasons. For hours, the world waited for Evelyn Carter to react, to tear the airline apart, to demand consequences, to say something sharp or angry or devastating. But when she finally spoke, it wasn't what anyone expected. She didn't go live, didn't post a long thread. Instead, she tweeted just one message. "We live. We learn. I've fought too long for justice to let one moment define anyone's future." And just like that, the internet froze. The energy shifted. People blinked, scrolled back up, read it again. She wasn't calling for revenge, wasn't demanding cancellations. She was offering perspective. And suddenly, the mob that had been ripping Miss Reynolds apart hesitated. New voices entered the conversation. Maybe she deserves a second chance. Evelyn Carter could have destroyed her. Instead, she did something harder. She gave her grace. "We cancel people too fast. If she can forgive, maybe we should too." And then, the biggest twist of all. Evelyn Carter sat in her hotel room that night, watching the city lights through the window. Her phone vibrated once. A direct message. From Miss Reynolds. She glanced at the name, then at the words on the screen. "I was wrong. I see that now. I'm sorry." Evelyn exhaled slowly. Her lips curled. Just slightly. She had seen this before. She had seen it all. And in the end, the same truth always remained. People make mistakes. The real question was, did they learn from them?